Hello, my guest this afternoon is Andrew Fierberg, a New York independent film producer with over 35 films produced already. Hello, thank you very much for being here with us and to give us this opportunity of talking to you. I would like to start by, we've been on a seminar with you this afternoon, and you started your seminar talking about the new landscape that surrounds film production nowadays, with the appearance of the web and multitude of distribution channels and all that. And you've quite resumed everything about either being optimistic or pessimistic in terms of how you view your work and producing films in this new landscape. So after 35 films, how do you see yourself? As an optimistic or as a pessimistic?
I mean, the question is the state of the industry. And is one optimistic about the ability within the industry to reach a larger audience? Do you feel optimistic about the idea of the ability for filmmakers to realize their own vision, to make their own films, to sort of be able to be in control of their storytelling? So in terms of the optimistic part, I would say that it's never been a better moment to be able to tell stories from a visual standpoint, whether it's from for the cinema or for the web or for the gallery, art museums, however you would like to, wherever you feel that that visual storytelling is appropriate. I think the time has never really been better. There's a pessimism because of the quantity of filmmaking that has been going on, because it seems so easy to sort of make films. I'm not so sure that the quality and the discipline and the rigor is at the foremost of the filmmaker's intention. I think a lot of times people feel that making films or making videos or doing things are a means in which to capture some other kind of reinforcement, whether it's financial or to be a movie star or to be famous, that the idea of storytelling is become a little undisciplined, if you will. And it concerns me that it's never been easier to be able to make something. The cameras are better, the apparatus, from the sound to the image, it's so much superior than it was 20 years ago, that one would think that would lend itself towards an increased and a more sophisticated storytelling. And perhaps I feel that storytellers are falling a bit by the wayside in exchange for the ease in which people can make these kind of images and they can make movies. That I think that there's a discipline of filmmaking that is falling perhaps by the wayside. And that is something for me a concern. But I do believe that every generation sort of gets the filmmakers they deserve. And so I have to also put my faith in the process and understand that there's a new generation of people making films and that they're learning language in the same way that we learned our language in a much more complicated, cumbersome kind of industry. I mean, when we first started making films, to have the camera, the apparatus of the camera and the films and the cutting, and I remember when I first started, people edited by cutting film. I remember the bins that you would go into an editing facility and it would be 4 floors of editors, and they had all the film hanging from these bins that people would cut and snip. And that when people first started to cut on the Avid, cut digitally, friends of mine who were editors asked me, should I take a class and learn how to cut on a computer? And I said, no, film will always be with us. And it's changed. And so the way in which filmmakers learn to tell stories when every single cut was an important physical
decision.
decision made it so that you actually took those decisions perhaps more seriously. And now people just cut and cut and cut and cut and perhaps overcut. And perhaps the pacing and the storytelling is a little more frantic and perhaps a little more undisciplined. And I think that there is room for concern about that.
Yeah, I fully agree on the editing part.
Mm-hmm.
I can witness that with the way my students work and the way they face the editing process as itself. But producing is still producing. Do you think those, not about the language, but you think those evolutions in technology also affect the way you produce a film? Do you feel that changing from the years you started up until now?
I think from a producing standpoint, the process is very much still the same, but the scale has changed. I think before it was much more difficult to say, well, can we just make this film? Let's just get people in a room and actually make this project. And we have actors and we have a location and we can go outside and shoot the film. And all we need to do is have a camera that we can buy in a store. And there's nothing to keep us from making this film a certain way. We can do it. On the other hand, there's this idea of each film has a certain kind of, not technology connected to it, but a certain kind of artistic intent. And I think that from a producing standpoint, it's much more difficult to set limits and to set expectations for the correct intent. So if I'm making a film and we feel that it should be shot on film, an actual film itself, we should be able to find a way in which to do that because the storytelling device is better told in that image. It doesn't all have to be done with your iPhone. But on the other hand, if the decision is that this is a work in progress, we're trying to find our language here, and it's very rough and tumble and this and that, and an iPhone would work for it, then that becomes a decision as a producer that we can take. But I think that those choices are much more complicated than one imagines. I think that there's an easy answer: just shoot it on a D4 or what, just get an HD camera and shoot the film. But I don't know necessarily that that's the correct producing decision. I think a lot of times as a producer you have to start thinking, how does this film live visually? What is the visual? It's a visual medium, and you have to respect that. And just because the film is clear and crisp and HD-like doesn't necessarily mean that it's good looking. So my responsibility is also to make a beautiful, if that's the intention, or an ugly, if that's the intention, piece of storytelling that has to live past myself. It's not only for the moment. It just isn't, in my mind. It just can't be, there's too much work involved for it just to be an online moment that people click on and then 2 weeks later it disappears. So I think that as a producer one has to think about those issues because we live in a very disposable culture. And my job is to sort of protect that, the indisposable nature of cinema, the things that will last longer, that will continue and will be representation of the time we lived in. Whether it's a narrative or a documentary or whatever, there's a responsibility to make work well, to make work well done, something like that. There's a responsibility to leave a legacy in some kind of way, and I think that's for everybody.
Yeah, of course. And do you feel there's any? When I presented you, I presented you as an independent New York film producer. Do you think there's a specificity into being a New York film producer?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I've made a decision early on in my life not to go to Los Angeles and make films, and there are people who worked for me who have gone on and gone to Los Angeles, and the person I gave his first job to, and I hired him as he was a PA on a film, and I hired him as my assistant, and then he became a production manager for me. Just won an Academy Award for 12 Years a Slave for producing that film. And it was because he was able to go to L.A. and to sort of play in that field, to sort of market himself as someone who, while he still lives in New York, he marketed himself as somebody that could go back and forth from LA and understood the logic of the Los Angeles producing world. In contrast or in complement to that, I look more towards the European producers to work with. My films have always been much more connected to a European sensibility, but the European producer spends so much of their time worrying about how you work your way through the politics and the state and matching the things and going to the festivals to be able to combine your national movie with another national, so what they spend, the European producer spends a lot of time doing is networking and fundraising within the state system. Whereas being in New York, being neither in LA where I have subsidies from the studios and I work on budgets that are large enough to be able to accommodate that, or the European model, which is about state funding, I have to sort of walk a balance. And the New York City producers in general have been very successful in creating a body of work that I think is representational of that kind of strange hybrid of filmmaking. It's not studio filmmaking, it's not mass entertainment, but it's also not state subsidized, politically correct, if you will, or politically organized kind of filmmaking. So it's a unique place, and I think that in general, if you look at the body of work that not just me, but a lot of the American independent producers have done over the course years, I think the films that we've made have been quite impressive. They've been very, very much an international success in that way. We've touched a lot of people.
Yeah. And how do you select a project that you want to work on? How do you look for projects?
I was explaining before that if I was directing or if I was writing, then I would make something that I knew. I would tell a story that I could talk about from a deep internal point of view. As a producer, that isn't my job. My job is to find somebody who believes in something, who has a vision, who has an articulated worldview, and support that person and make that person's film better by collaboration, by being sometimes the adult in the room, by sometimes just being a friend, or sometimes just being a sort of a benign critic of what's going on, just to sort of make it better. So I choose things based on things that I don't think that I would ever make on my own. So I find projects that I would learn something from. I don't want to make films with people and just learn about to know what I know. I mean, my journey as a producer has always been to learn about different places and different things and different storytelling devices and material from the world. So I'm much more attracted to something that I just didn't think about before. It just wasn't, I never thought, I'm going to make a cutting movie, a movie about this or a movie about that. Just one day someone comes up to me or sends me a script, or I'm introduced to somebody and they tell me a story that I go, wow, I don't know how to do that. I've never done that before. That sounds interesting. I don't mind spending the next 2 years, 3 years working on a project about this because I find it interesting.
And after 35 films produced, you decided to direct one.
Yeah.
It wasn't hard. It was difficult for you to change the role. You had a producer working with you. You produced.
I in the end produced it with people. I think that the mistake I made on that was not finding me to help me, and I think that was a mistake. But on the other hand, I had reached a very specific point in my career producing where I wasn't enjoying being on set. I was not enjoying it as much as I should have been. And I thought that perhaps if I took a step back and tried to do something different in the film business, storytelling-wise, that it would provide me with a great deal of pleasure, or would be an interesting journey connected to what I've been doing. What I found is I think I did a very good job. I liked my film a lot. I think we did a really great job for what we could do. I'm not sure 100% that it was the most successful experience in terms of viewership and how it was received. But what it allowed me to do was to sort of put myself in the shoes of the director and understand a lot better the kind of torturous procedure that comes from accepting responsibility for what happens on set and also how it's received. Because as a producer, you could always step back a little and say, yeah, I produced it, but the director was a screw-up. Or, they made a bad decision here and I couldn't do anything about it. And to sort of be able to be in that situation where I had to accept responsibility for my own decisions from a really psychoanalytic standpoint, re-engaged me in being able to sort of work and produce again and work on films. And to a certain extent, it reinvigorated my belief in the process, because I had sort of become disillusioned with being on set and watching people muddle their way through their directing experience, and I thought I could do better. And in fact, I did do better. No, I learned that it's just as difficult, if not harder, to be put in a situation where you're making those decisions and you can't hide, than just sit and watch and judge. Equally difficult, not necessarily one worse than the other, but I actually found that it reinvigorated my experience in terms of filmmaking. I enjoyed it tremendously, but I also understood that it probably wasn't for me. You know what I mean? It was an interesting experience. Nobody was hurt, let's put it that way.
And you talked about your experience on Fur, the Diane Arbus history film.
Right.
And you talked a lot as your experience as producer of how to relate with the director, with the actors, with everybody. And you always put your tone in the idea of collaborative effort. And that for me I think is very interesting, to hear a producer saying that. You think it has, I want to do two questions at the same time. Do you think it has to do with the independent environment, that idea of having a creative collaborative effort in the building up of a film project? And how do you create that collaborative effort between everybody?
Well, the first thing is about the idea and how one views the filmmaking process. Some people, some producers, very successful producers, believe that they do it by giving orders or by being the driving force of the whole process. And I'm not begrudging them. It's whether it's a Scott Rudin or to name these people that are very successful, but their work method, their process is much more driven towards being the primary motivator of the project. And I've never felt that was. I've always viewed my filmmaking relations to be creating a safe environment for all the creative people involved to find the best movie they can make within the limitations of the finances or the limitations of the actors or the limitations of whatever we have, because there's always limitations. And so if you don't trust the people, my job was always to hire well. Like, I have to accept the consequences of making a bad decision in terms of my sound guy or my editor or my cinematographer. But once I've made that decision to hire, I have to let them do their job. I mean, that's the whole point. And so as a philosophy, I go into all of my projects, and I always have, as saying, I am only as good, and the film is only as good as the pieces of the puzzle. And if some director is acting poorly and treating a PA or one of their creative talent badly, well, it's not always my responsibility to defend that person. It's my responsibility to try to minimize that kind of effect on the ambient of the film, because in a funny kind of way, you are what you eat, and if you make a film that's filled with bad energy and hostility and frustration, in my mind, sometimes you see that at the end of the day. And I'm not saying every film should be fun, or every film should be, but every film should be filled with mutual respect for all the characters and people and all the trades people and all the people that have come together to work hard And you have to work hard on making a film. Yeah. Anyone who pretends that it's fun to make a film doesn't understand how much torture and how engaged you have to be and how focused you have to be for so long. I feel that if you don't respect that process, in the end, you just have to accept those consequences. And I prefer to accept the consequences of collaboration and to fail on that collaborative edge, as opposed to succeed and have everybody talk about what a horrible experience it was and how it's not what they wanted to do and how somebody was always looking over their shoulders. So I think that there is a philosophy of certain producers that look. They spend the whole time when the movie's being shot, and they're standing in front of a monitor, and all they do is look at the monitor and they comment and they say, "Can we do another close-up? Can we do this? I don't think you did that." And that's not my style. My job is to hire well and to get out of the way, and then when it's done, and to problem solve. When there's a problem, I need to be focused. I need to know that there's a problem. But the way I do that is not by being present or being always in someone's face or always being the person that knows the right answer. I don't believe in that. I actually don't believe there's ever one right way to do anything, certainly not make a film. There are plenty of wrong ways, and I've seen the wrong ways, and it's not something that I particularly want to spend any time engaged in. I think bad behavior is just bad behavior. Yeah. And there's a reputation when you work in film that bad behavior is a sign of genius, or bad behavior is a sign of somebody who's really, focused and committed. And sometimes bad behavior is just bad behavior, Yeah. And it really shouldn't be tolerated. But that's, I don't fight certain fights anymore.
You used to fight it.
I used to fight a little bit more, but now I sort of feel like I can talk to people and get to where we need to get to as filmmakers without having to have a rupture, without having to have a fight or break.
But you had cases in which, for example, we see that the film was not going through the right direction, and you as a producer, in your standpoint, could watch that. Did you intervene, or? Yeah,
I think you have to intervene. But I think you can intervene only to the extent that you don't stop the process. If you stop the process, if you brain lock people, if you become a person that enters into a conflict and that freezes everyone, then nobody wins. So at some point you try, and if you can't do it, you have to also know when to step back, because you can't win. It's kind of like winning battles, losing war. I won the battle, but I lost the war. And losing the war when you're making a film is a disaster, because it's a machine. You're in war. Basically, once you start to make a film, time is not your friend. Time is your enemy. Every day it only has a certain amount of hours, and you only have a certain amount of days in that week, and you only have a certain amount of film in the camera, and you only have a certain amount. It's all limited. And if you stop it, if you break it, then you end up with nothing. And at some point, one has to be mature enough to understand that my hubris, my believing that I'm right, isn't really, in the end, good for the film. It's better for the film that I'm right, but I give it up. I don't fight that battle anymore. I step back, because it doesn't help me. It certainly doesn't help me to have, the process freeze up and create more problems. Sometimes you find that producers or financiers or people who have control think they can influence it more than they can. But once you're shooting, it's caution to the wind. You just have to believe in the people you hired and the people that you've been working with and the collaborative spirit. And you really have to believe in it.
Yeah. Let it flow.
You've got to be a little zen-y about it. As pathetic as that sounds from a New York producer, I think that one would argue that breathing is the best policy for 80% of all problems. You just take a deep breath, and it will all work out. Yeah. And it always does.
Yeah, there's a question I have to ask you, because I think it's on the head of most of my students. Probably for you it's a bit boring to answer, but anyway, you've told before that in Europe most of the film production is financed by the state, and that's actually correct. Mm-hmm. But you probably know that we are also in a huge economical crisis. For example, in Portugal, we are in a huge economical crisis. The financing from the state almost been paralyzed from the last couple of years. So on my students' heads, it's this idea of how can we find alternatives to be able to finance our projects. So I think it would be interesting for them to understand, how do you finance a film in New York?
Well, it's, you know...
Where do you search for the money?
Well, you know, look, the world is filled with people who make a lot of money. I mean, and I know there's a crisis in Europe, and I'm not minimizing it, but there's still people in Portugal and, you know, all over the world.
When I'm referring to the crisis, I'm referring that one of the things that happened with the crisis is the fact that the states lowered the financing hugely.
Yeah, no, I understand. Look, my position is, because I'm an American, and that's an unfortunate place of birth, but, you know, you can't expect the state, filmmakers shouldn't expect people to take care of them. I mean, it's not that kind of a thing. It's not food, it's not transportation, it's not the essential, I mean, it is an essential element of culture, but it's not an essential element of what the state necessarily has an obligation to always provide. I think that it's been wonderful that the culture of Europe has subsidized and supported its artists, and I would love it to live in a place where we had that experience. But we've made all these films with a combination of finding private money, finding people who are interested in the filmmaking process, who have a little bit of money to lose, but then also just sort of accepting the fact that, you know, there's the fantasy that someone's going to come in and give you all the money that you need to make your movie. I mean, you know, there's a sense of entitlement that I don't think it exists in any other field in the world, that just because you have a good idea that somebody should support you and help you make this project that costs all this money to make. It's fine. You want to write a book. Sit at home in your room and write the book. You know what I mean? But if you want the apparatus, if you want the stuff, you have to find a way within whatever culture you live in, and as bad as it is here now, it's been worse certainly in China, and people made movies, and I mean all over the world people have always made movies. They found a way to do it. And it always hasn't been because the government gave you money, because you sat back and waited. It's your life. And it's a stupid thing to say, and you know, maybe it's a stupider thing to say to your students, but you have to seize your own day. You know, you can't wait for someone to finally come around and say, oh, you're a genius, let me give you some money. I mean, it's great. I mean, if it happens, you know, but if not, at some point you roll up your thing and you say, well, what do we need to do to make it? And maybe that's compromise. Maybe that's making it smaller. Maybe that's using a different camera. Maybe it's doing it with friends. Maybe the actors won't, you know, whatever that is. Or maybe it's going around and maybe it is going to Kickstarter or some kind of, you know, public funding, you know, where you try to go online and figure it out. Or maybe it's talking to people in your family and saying, you know, this is my chance. You know, you believe in me. Help me try to find a way to raise some money. And then whatever money you have, at some point, you have to make a decision to make it the movie or not. And I think that that's always been the state that I've always gotten to with all the films. It's never enough money. It's never enough time. You never have the right actors. You get what you have. Your project reaches a certain point, and that's where it is. And then the difficulty is to say, I accept that, and I'm going to make it for whatever we have. And if it's $20, it's $20. If it's 10 million, it's 10 million. But in any case, you're going to resent the fact that it's not enough. You don't have enough time. I mean, I know people who have made $50 million movies, and they say, if only I had 55. You know, and I've seen the budgets, and they always say, we can't do it for that amount of money. Can you imagine doing a budget for $50 million and someone coming up and saying, we don't have enough money to make this? I mean, to me, it's kind of silly. And there's no question that if you talk to the line producer or the people who did the budgets for what the director wanted and what the expectations are of the studio, that $50 million isn't enough. It's true.
Yeah.
But there's always a way to go back and say, well, this is what we got, and this is what we're going to do, and let's try to just make it work. And again, because the apparatus, because the cameras and the sound and the locations, and so much is more available on a sort of a non-financial basis. The cameras don't cost what they used to cost. Everyone's got a camera. I mean, again, I know it's a stupid thing to say, but half of people's phones, the images that you can take with a phone, are so superior to some of the 16-millimeter cameras that they used to use to make films that it's kind of it's a bit of a lie to say that you can't go off and do something. The question is, do you have something to say? Do you have a story worth telling? And I think if you have something to say and something worth telling, I think you'll find a way. And again, this obsession to have to get it made, I think that you'll find a way to do it. And it's as stupid as that. I mean, there's no magic bullet. There's no, if you do this and do that and do this, you're going to get the money you need to make the film. It's always the same. It's never enough time, never enough money, never the right actors. You're just lucky. And so what you got to do is kind of pull up your, it's an American thing, you know, you pull up your bootstraps and make your movie. Get on the horse there, buddy. It's embarrassing. But again, I can only say that it's worked for me and the filmmakers that I've worked with. We've always found that at some point, we just accept what we have and we make a movie. And the rest is, you know, reception. Or how well you do it. But the idea of blaming yourself or blaming other people or blaming this or that, the other thing, because you don't have enough resources is very particular and peculiar to film people. It's a little bit of a spoiled community. Like they really believe that there's an obligation somewhere for someone to support them. And it doesn't exist in any other industry in the world. There's nothing like it, for better or worse.
In your career, in your 35 films that you've produced, is there a special film, a film that you regard as a special, in which you have your, looking back, you have a bigger emotional involvement?
Well, they're just films. There are films that I just feel extraordinarily proud. You know, they're in that group. There's films that I'm a little embarrassed about because I made them for the wrong reasons. I mean, there was a time when I made some movies because I felt it would help my company. I always believed in having a company. I always believed I should be, you know, like I was saying about Kickstarter. I don't believe in that. I believe that there should be an industry. There should be a support, and you should make it. So I always thought I should have a business. So I always had a business, a company. And I had people who would do research and work for me. I paid people, and I found ways to pay people. And there were some films that I took in order to pay the bills. And I would say those films I'm not particularly proud of. And I don't think they stand up, and I probably did them for the wrong reasons. There are certain films that I feel just were elevated, and they were elevated by the luck, the timing, the group that we put together. And certainly Hamlet with Ethan Hawke, and Keane with Lodge Kerrigan, and Yes with Sally Potter, and 13 Conversations are films that I think stand the test of time. I think they have something to say and have a certain kind of longevity to them. Secretary, even Fur, which has been unjustly maligned, but is a difficult film. But these were films that were very hard to make, that were very underappreciated during the process of raising money and trying to put together, and that became kind of successful and understood once they were done. And that's the other process. You know, you try to raise money and someone says, well, nobody wants to see that movie. And then you show the movie and people go, wow, why didn't someone make that before? So you realize at that point you've done something right.
Yeah. You also shown this morning a very beautiful art piece that you've produced also.
Right.
Is that a new trend in your...
Well, we were discussing a little bit, but I believe, you know, that I'm kind of an international cinema guy, and I've been very distressed and disheartened by the amount of sort of renationalization of pretty much everything, where people have become much more xenophobic in general, where before I felt the world was heading in a different direction, and it was borders were being broken down. Now I see them being built up. Interestingly enough, for me in the art world, there's a kind of internationalist feeling to what's being produced, that the galleries, the museums, that the moving images that are being projected on the walls in the galleries are speaking much more an international language of aesthetic and storytelling that is short format. It's not linguistically based per se, but it does speak to a certain kind of aesthetic language that crosses borders. And yes, so therefore I'm doing more work in that. I actually find it interesting. I find the apparatus of working with artists to be much more intelligible than to working with agents and managers and money people who are all worried about how to recoup their money or how to get this person or their person paid. In the art world, to a certain extent, the artist has a reputation. The piece of work has to live up to the reputation of the artist. And if it does that, then it will be successful because the artist will be successful. So the only obligation we have when we make these films is to make the artist comfortable with the work that was done. All the other parts of the market, all the other kinds of merchandising and stuff like that is outside that sort of job description. So it's kind of liberating because you can just go in and make the piece. You don't have as much money. You don't have to do the you don't have the actor stuff. There's not a thing, but you don't have the process of having to always balance the decisions based on how you're going to market the piece. Yeah. It's just not part of the deal, and that's kind of liberating.
Yeah, in a way, that's not also a bit of a disappointment with cinema itself and the way it's evolving?
Well, again, I feel to a certain extent people like me, producers who start and finish a project are becoming a little bit of an endangered species. The Hollywood films are certainly broken up much more in terms of, segmentation, much more like you're building a car.
Yeah.
And you get the deal makers, and you get the line producers, and you get the editors and the post-production person, and you get the studio, but you don't get, half the directors on these big studio movies they're not even there at the end of the movie. They don't even care. So that's a problem. And then the smaller films, for the younger filmmakers, I just believe very strongly that they should get their own producers, and they should get the people around them that they want to work. I'm too old to work with a 22-year-old person on a $60,000 or $30,000 film. I mean, it doesn't work for them, and it doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
I don't mind helping, I don't mind supporting, but they should find their own group.
Yeah, in a way, it's the same thing that we talked before about the directors that are not that young anymore, but they don't reach the blockbuster industry. They are in a difficult
They're
point.
living in Never Land, and to a certain extent, that was we at one moment in my life, and with a lot of different directors, we had a model. It was $1.5 million. It was 35 days. It was with a certain level of actors, and we could have just kept making them for the rest of our lives. And then the internet happened. And then everyone could say, then the digital cameras came out, and everyone could say, well, make it for less money. Make it for, make it for 1.2, make it for 900,000, make it for 800,000. How low can you go? And then you found like producers who would lie, and they would say, well, I can make that for $50,000. So you were playing this game of limbo where you're constantly getting lower and lower and lower, and the films are getting worse and worse and worse. And some directors just can't do that. They can't play in that game.
Yeah.
And they were not by any stretch of the imagination built to spend $60 million. They're just not built like it. They didn't have any interest in that. I mean, maybe in fantasy they wanted to do it, but they were storytellers.
Yeah.
And their storytellers were at a certain disciplined level, and they had developed their craft and made their way through it. And then all of a sudden the market just said, we're not interested in you guys anymore. We want to see either new product or spectacle. And I think the Europeans have been lucky in the way that their filmmakers of the generation that I come from have been supported. Now, perhaps they've been supported at the expense of the young filmmakers.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
But on the other hand, you have these filmmakers who have gotten better and better and better. and they've had the chance to make their film. Maybe they're making the same films over and over again, and they shouldn't be making films anymore, and that money should go to kids. I could argue that, but it's not my place. It was my stomach.
Okay, so, well, thank you very much for the interview. I think we've done here.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure for me. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you.